All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're heading back about 2.5 millennia to unpack a text that is, honestly, just an incredibly precise psychological framework for solving a problem we literally deal with every single day. We're talking about human conflict. Whether it's a centuries-old war or, a massive argument over who left their dishes in the sink, the mechanics are actually the same. We're going to explore the Sakka-pañha Sutta, or Sakka's questions. It's this beautifully structured, hyperlogical dialogue that cuts right to the absolute core of why we fight and, more importantly, how we can actually stop.
So, our source text kicks off with this guy, Sakka. He's a Deva king, essentially a ruler of mythical, godlike beings, and he asks this deeply relatable question. Fettered with what do Devas, human beings, nevertheless live in hostility? What I absolutely love about this is how perfectly it anchors these ancient, mythical beings right to our very modern reality. Sakka is pointing out a universal paradox here. Everyone, from celestial gods down to your most difficult coworkers, generally want to live in peace, right? We all want to be free from violence and rivalry, yet somehow we almost always end up in hostility.
Okay, let's dive into this. Why does this happen? This question is essentially the launch pad for an incredible psychological detective story. The dialogue doesn't just settle for some vague philosophical answer. It actually traces the root cause of human conflict backward, step by step. We're going to follow this causal chain right down to its absolute origin, dissecting the very mechanics of why we, beings who desperately want peace, just constantly manufacture conflict.
The Buddha's first answer hits right at the surface level of our violence and rivalry. He states that all beings are fettered, or basically chained down, by two very specific things: envy and stinginess. Envy of what others have, and stinginess with what we already possess. And honestly, when you look at almost any human conflict, whether it's a global war over resources or a petty office dispute over who gets credit for a project, you can usually spot these two culprits operating right at the surface.
But, the text doesn't stop there. Mimicking this great, rapid-fire Socratic rhythm, Sakka immediately presses further. If envy and stinginess are the cause of hostility, well, what exactly is the cause of envy and stinginess? Where do these toxic traits actually come from? Because they certainly don't just appear out of thin air.
The response reveals that envy and stinginess originate from something that seems totally innocent at first: our preferences. Specifically, what the text calls the dear and not dear. Envy and stinginess bubble up simply because we divide the entire world into two distinct categories: the things, people, and outcomes we like, and the things we don't. The very moment we draw that line in the sand, between the shiny things we want and the unpleasant things we want to avoid, we create this incredibly fertile ground for envy and stinginess to grow.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact architecture of conflict, step by step. When Sakka asks where the dear and not dear come from, the answer is striking. It's desire. Our preferences stem directly from our base desire. Just follow the chain reaction here. Desire creates our preferences for the dear and not dear. Those preferences generate envy and stinginess. And finally, envy and stinginess boil over into open hostility.
So, we push further back. What causes desire? The text explains that desire is born from thinking. Desire isn't just something that passively happens to us out of nowhere, it's actively generated by our thinking. When we obsess over an object, a person, or some future outcome we want, our continuous thoughts act like gears, constantly churning and funneling into desire. If we weren't obsessively thinking about something, the desire for it literally couldn't take root.
You can kind of feel the tension building here in the text. We are fast approaching the ultimate psychological villain of this explainer. If thinking causes desire, which causes preferences, which causes envy, which causes hostility, we have to ask, what's the prime mover? What is triggering this entire cascade of thoughts in the first place?
So, the crucial point is, the Buddha reveals the ultimate source, and it comes down to how our eyes and minds perceive the world, the perceptions and categories of objectification. In the original Pali language, the word used is papancha. Now, I know, categories of objectification sounds incredibly heavy and academic, but stick with me, because we're going to break it down right now, and understanding this concept truly changes everything. To simplify the jargon, papancha is essentially the ego mind. It's the tendency of our minds to obsessively proliferate, or spin up, issues stemming from a constructed sense of self. It is that constant, self-reflexive inner monologue that says, this is me, this is mine, this affects me. The root of all conflict is this ego mind constantly making everything in the universe about me and mine. It's that voice that reads a totally neutral text message and immediately panics, thinking, wait, are they mad at me? That internal objectification turns back on us, creating inner turmoil.
which then inevitably expands outward into strife with everybody else. All right, having isolated the virus, the ego mind, or papancha, Sakka naturally asks for the cure. And the Buddha doesn't offer some mystical, complicated ritual here. He provides a highly practical, binary antidote. It's a razor-sharp mental filter designed to stop the ego mind right in its tracks. The idea is that everything we experience falls strictly into two categories: things to be pursued and things not to be pursued. Here's how this incredibly pragmatic test works. You have to evaluate every feeling, even seemingly positive things like joy, grief, or equanimity. You stop and ask yourself, as I pursue this feeling of joy, do unskillful mental qualities increase and skillful ones decline? If the answer is yes, do not pursue it, drop it. But if pursuing that joy causes unskillful qualities to decline and skillful qualities to increase, then absolutely pursue it. It's a strict, brutally honest audit of what an action or emotion is actually doing to your character. Now, the text adds a really fascinating layer of nuance here. It notes that these states, joy, grief, and equanimity, can actually be experienced in two ways, accompanied by directed thought and evaluation, or entirely free of it. And mental states that are free of directed, churning thought are always considered more refined and advanced, which makes perfect sense, right? If thinking is the spinning tornado that fuels our ego, then a joy that exists without that mental chatter is naturally like a still pool of water. It's a purer, much less conflicted state. Let's move to and see how this builds outward into our physical lives. When Sakka asks how a monk practices restraint in their outward conduct, the exact same framework is applied to literally everything we do. Whether it's our bodily conduct, our verbal conduct, or the things we actively search for in life, they all have to pass the test. Speak, act, and seek only if it increases skillful qualities and diminishes unskillful ones. It's that simple and that rigorous. Grasping the profound simplicity of this, Sakka summarizes it beautifully. He realizes we basically have to put up a shield and guard literally all of our senses. From the forms we see with our eyes, to the sounds we hear, the flavors we taste, and crucially, even the ideas we process with our intellect. Every single input into our consciousness has to be rigorously filtered through this one single question. Is this increasing my skillful qualities or my unskillful ones? At this point, the dialogue pivots. Sakka asks a deeply philosophical follow-up question. He's basically saying, okay, if this framework is so clear and logical, do all the other religious teachers, contemplatives, and philosophers out there aim at the same goal? Do they all teach the same doctrine and want the same outcome? And the Buddhist answer is a very direct, unequivocal no. The reason they differ is fascinating. It turns out that the world is made of many, many various properties, and people, including these teachers, tend to fixate on just one of these properties. They become totally entrenched. They latch onto it, dogmatically claiming, only this is true, anything else is absolutely worthless. This fixation on partial truths is exactly why not everyone reaches the ultimate goal and why there's just so much conflicting, dogmatic doctrine in the world.
To really drive the point home, the actual ultimate goal is stated clearly here. It isn't just about finding some comforting philosophy to latch onto. Only those who achieve the total ending of craving break the chains completely and are entirely free from their bonds. Anything less than the total cessation of craving, well, it just leaves you vulnerable to that entire chain of conflict we mapped out earlier.
Hearing this, Sakka just expresses this profound relief. He calls yearning a disease, an arrow that's been stuck in him. And he shares this genuinely funny anecdote. He says he actually went out to the wilderness to ask these exact same deep psychological questions to other supposedly wise gurus, and they were so completely stumped by his questions, they ended up asking Sakka who he was and became his disciples instead. The Buddha alone was able to finally remove the arrow of his uncertainty.
Reflecting on this, Sakka contrasts his old life with this entirely new understanding. As a Dīgha king, his greatest past joy was literally winning physical, bloody wars against rival beings. But that joy was firmly rooted in the sphere of violence and weapons. His new joy, found in this profound psychological clarity, is in the sphere of no violence. It leads not to more ego and more fighting, but to calm, dispassion, and actual self-awakening.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that we have reached the climax of the entire text. As Sakka absorbs this teaching, he experiences a massive shift in consciousness. The text says, there arose in him the dustless, stainless Dhamma I. And it is beautifully summarized in one incredibly potent sentence. Whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. It's the profound, visceral realization of impermanence. If everything that begins must eventually end, there is simply nothing worth clinging to, and that noisy ego mind is finally silenced.
We've unpacked a 2,500-year-old psychological masterclass today. We saw how the ego mind manufactures thoughts, which birth desires, creating preferences that just explode into envy, stinginess, and ultimately open hostility. But we were also given the exact antidote. So I want to leave you with a provocative thought to carry into your day. When you're consuming media, when you're having a conversation, or when you're simply sitting alone and thinking, what are you pursuing today? And is it increasing your skillful or unskillful qualities? Try using this ancient tool to evaluate your own ego mind today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and we'll catch you next time.